guys, welcome back to another Touchdesigner tutorial. Sorry, Mike still not arrived, but we push on. Today we're going to be learning how to take a OBJ or any object of that matter and translate it into a point cloud of itself. What that essentially means is that we can see here we have this giant little wee Miffy, and when we zoom right into it, it's made up of a bunch of smaller versions of itself, and you can get this really cool effect where we have it slowly zoom out and dance around. We're also going to make this project audio reactive, and I should mention that I am making this tutorial as beginner friendly as possible, but there is actually a longer, even more beginner version of this uploaded for free on my Patreon. I'll make sure that's released to the public. But today I'm just going to try to zoom through for anyone just trying to copy this. But if you'd like the project file to play around with and just download immediately and use in any of your own work, then please go over to my Patreon and you can access that file now. Cool. Alright. So starting from left to right, we have this file in here for a SOP, which is the objects we're going to use today. So you can just drag and drop your object file into Touchdesigner and it'll appear like this, or you can get a file in from the SOP tab. We're going to follow this top line first, and this is going to define the small wee objects that make up the larger one. So I've connected it to this poly reduce. Just for performance sake, this was made up of a lot of polygons, but I've turned it down to 4% just to make it a lot more computationally easy to render in real time. Play around with this percentage until it looks fine, but again this will be the smaller model, so it doesn't need to look that great. I then have it connected to a transform. Now it should note all the transform nodes that I have in this tutorial will be relative to your own object. This object here, you can see it's not at 0, 0 and is scaled up to over 100. So whenever I have a transform tab like this, you're welcome to copy the parameters, but also feel free to just omit this information, add in your own transform, and then play around with the scaling it down, and rotating and translating it on the different axes to get something you like. So next I've connected it to this material. Again, you can right click and type in material, connect it like so. And then in this material, I've gone ahead and gone to the materials tab by pressing tab and then here, and gotten a PBR. So this is a type of material, and I've picked a color of pink. I've dragged down the roughness to keep it quite reflected and turn down the ambient occlusion a tiny bit. This was sort of the color I was going for in this tutorial, and just dragged and dropped this onto the material here. You can actually do this directly onto the geometry here, but in case you want to play around with different materials or switch between different materials, this is a really good way of doing it also. I then have it connected to another transform. This is a audio reactive component that we're going to revisit later, so feel free to just ignore this for now, or just add it in and we can adjust it later. And then finally to this attribute create, which is not actually needed for this tutorial, but sometimes the render will complain about not having compute normals on, so feel free to add this in and toggle on both these tabs for that sake. Then you want to right click and go over to the comp tab and connect it to a geometry node like so. And if I just disable instancing, you will see that you will have your singular wee little object like here, like so, and you want to go ahead and add a camera, press tab, add camera, and the light source like so. I also have the dimmer turned up a little bit. I also have an environment light here. This is completely optional. If I get rid of it, well actually that's really small, you won't be able to see, but it just adds a little bit more reflectiveness to it, but it's so small right now, sorry. I have this environment light connected to a map, which just gives it a bit of a chromia feel. Completely optional. And then go ahead and grab a render top. And then all of these values will be set. Geometry rendering all of them, rendering all the lights, and then camera 1. Feel free to play around with this camera position as you like. And you should be able to display it as background and get this little wee guy here floating. So that's pretty much it to get the smaller makeups, so the small objects rendering. I'm now going to push forward onto the bottom row here. So I've connected this to another poly reduce. Now this poly reduce I have set to a higher percentage because this is going to be the bigger overall piece and I wanted to keep more detail. This particular model also stretched in a weird way, which is why some of the middle parts were missing. But you know, it's the best you can sort of do with a model that you downloaded. Once again, transform relative to your own model. Feel free to add this in here and then play around with the settings if you need to move your object around. Oh, sorry. I've then connected this transform to a SOP, so you can do that by right-clicking here and going, to a chop and then going SOP to. So SOP to chop. Make sure you enable position XYZ, and then from the chop to a top, like so. And then in this chop, it's important that we set the data format from R to RGB. Basically, that is converting this 3D object into a encoded RGB version of it, which we can then use parameters on. This chop is then connected to a noise node. Feel free to copy these settings. We will revisit this later as it is an audio reactive component. And then it is connected to a point transform. So that is again going to transform our object into a bunch of little wee points that we're going to use to instance our object. Again, all of these translate options are relative to your own object. Mine was massive, so again I've scaled it down. And then I've connected it to two little wee nulls here. You can just do one if you want, but I separated these out in case you want to change them individually. So I have one here for the point transform and for the rotate transform. So now we go back to our geometry tab and we go to this, a geometry node and go to the instance tab here. When we click instancing, that won't happen. We'll get these options enabled and you can drag the PT or your first null into there and then set the translate X to R by clicking that or typing in R, Y to G and Z to B, and then do the same for the rotate, RGB with the rotate. What that essentially is going to do is create an instance of for every point that we pass in, so that we've calculated here, it's going to instance that smaller object onto it, and we'll end up with a bigger version made up of this. And so you should start to see this now, and again, in your rendering here, you might want to play around with the scales and transforms to make it to your liking. I also have in the pre-transform tab here, which I've enabled, I have a piece of code running on the X and Z axis, which is this ABS time times seconds times 10. Essentially, this is just taking the seconds of the project file and timesing it by 10, which is going to rotate the object, like the entire overall object, 10 times faster than what time is passing, so it just gets a perpetual spin going on, which is quite nice in my opinion. Cool, so from this render I have a little bit of post-processing effects. Firstly, I've connected it to a bloom here, which when we click the one afterwards, you can see it's giving it this sort of shine effect here. You can access a lot of these by clicking the palette browser button here and going to image filters, and we have bloom and a bunch of other effects. Drag them in, it's a bunch of smaller wee nodes inside them. Connect them up, connect it out to a null, play with the effects, get something you like. Again, feel free to copy what I have here if you want. I then have it connected to a transform. Don't worry, no actual transformations going on here, just using the background color, setting it to white and then comping over background, which gives us this nice wee white background like so. And then connected it to a movie file out to record. There's lots of different ways to set backgrounds. You can comp it over an image instead, but this is just the simplest way in my opinion, especially if you have a transparent background like so. Cool, alright, 10 minutes in. I'm trying to make this as quick as possible if that's not obvious. Hate super long-winded tutorials, especially for something with so little nodes here. If you want the longest tutorial, head over to my Patreon, it's free, I go a lot slower and will explain things in more detail. Okay, so I should note that I have a zoom in and out effect going on, which if I go back to my background, enable that, and I'm going to turn off that noise. which sort of zooms in and out here. What I've done is I've created an LFO, and I'm just going to hide the background again, sorry, so it's easy to see, which pulsates between a value of 1 and -1 on default. Set the frequency to be much lower, which just makes it pulsate slower. Then I've connected it to a math. In the range tab, I've converted it, so I typed in -1 to 1, and then I've converted it to a range of 3.7 to 96. What I did is I went into the view tab on the camera and played around with the FOV angle and was like, I like it being this far out and I like it being this far in. I took note of those values, put it in this range here, and now this LFO is going to cycle between a range of that lowest point and the highest point that we like. You can make this active and then drag and drop this value and reference it on the angle, and it will go in and out between those two values that you've defined. I use this all the time, highly recommend that range tool. Cool, alright, let's make it audio reactive. So, audio file in here, I've just got the default one like so. You can right click or press tab and audio file in, or you can drag your file in, or even use an audio device straight in and do it in real time. I've then connected it to an audio device out, which is bypassed at the moment. This just allows you to hear it. Set your speakers like so. Then I have an audio analysis. Again, this sits under the palette browser. Go to tools, audio analysis, drag and drop that in here. Lots of different ways in Touchdesigner to make something audio reactive. This is by far the simplest and in my opinion the best, because you can easily interact with these UIs, tweak it to different parameters, and then if you need to extract any of these nodes, you can go inside here and grab this data or even play with it directly. So I highly recommend clicking plus and toggling on a bunch of these that you want to. You can also use the parameters on the right here. I've then connected it to a select, which just selects all the different values as numbers, and then a speed chop, and this is all default. So then if we go back to this noise here on the second row and re-enable it, you can see that I've got these parameters here, and I've played around with noise until I've found a sort of movement that I like. And I'm like, cool, I want to make that happen on the kick or on the low. So what I did is I went into the select, clicked plus to make it active, and then dragged and dropped this onto the harmonic gain, and was like, oh, that's not strong enough, so I also times it by 10. There's a million different ways to go about doing that. This is just the way I've chosen to do it this time around. I highly recommend in Touchdesigner, just for creative inspiration, whenever you're playing with different parameters and sliders like so, or little toggles or whatever it is, if you see a movement or like an animation you really like, I highly recommend assigning that to be audio reactive or just to pulsate over time like we did with the camera. It's a really simple way to add movement and life to your Touchdesigner creations, and it's just mostly how I come up with creating more unique audio reactive effects than just like the very simple ones that we're used to seeing all over the place. So yeah, feel free to toggle with this noise, and then when I press play, you can see every time there's a kick, it sort of explodes, animating this effect that I really liked. Finally, I have it connected to a speed, and if we go back up to the top row here, and we see this transform, we see I've taken the speed of this FMSD value and assigned it to the rotate. This is essentially looking at how much is happening at a song at any one point, and the higher the value it is, the more that's happening, and then the speed is calculating the speed of that in a perpetual growing way. So what that's going to do is make these smaller Miffys or smaller objects rotate in time with how much is happening in a song. So it's a very subtle effect, but essentially the more intense a song is, the faster these little guys are going to spin, and I didn't think it was spinning fast enough, so I also multiplied each of these values by 30. And that's pretty much it. That's pretty much the really condensed, hyper-fast version of this tutorial. Again, if you want to just download this project file directly, please do so from my Patreon. Open to requests, send me questions that you might have, whatever it is you need. If you need a longer, more slower tutorial, that's also available on Patreon, but please also leave feedback, and I hope to get a new mic soon. That's all from me today. I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening or day.